3D to 5D Explained, Awakening, Consciousness Shift, and Spiritual Transformation, by David Rousseau. You are not stuck in the world you see. You are shifting through worlds you cannot yet fully name. What if reality isn't something you live in, but something you move through? Human experience often feels fixed, anchored to a single identity, a single timeline, and a single interpretation of reality. We wake up each day assuming we are the same person we were yesterday, moving through a world that appears stable, external, and objectively defined. Yet both psychology and contemplative tradition suggest something more subtle. What we call reality is not only something we perceive, but something actively constructed through attention, memory, belief, and emotional state. This introduction explores consciousness as a layered and dynamic process rather than a static condition. The language of 3D, 4D, and 5D is used here not as a literal description of physical dimensions, but as a metaphorical framework for understanding shifts in human awareness. It describes how perception can evolve from survival-based identification with the external world to deeper self-reflection and emotional integration, and finally towards states of expanded awareness characterized by connection, presence, and reduced internal separation. In the most immediate mode of experience, what we might call a 3D perspective, life is organized around structure, stability, and survival. Identity is closely tied to roles, responsibilities, and external validation. The world is experienced as linear and separate, self versus other, success versus failure, safety versus threat. This mode is not inherently negative. It is necessary for functioning in physical reality. However, when it becomes rigid or exclusive, it can narrow perception and reinforce patterns of fear, reactivity, and disconnection. As awareness begins to turn inward, a different mode of perception can emerge. This 4D stage represents the development of introspection and psychological depth. Individuals begin to notice patterns in their thoughts, emotional reactions, and relationships. Questions arise about meaning, conditioning, and personal history. Time itself can feel less fixed, not because it has changed, but because memory and anticipation become more psychologically active. Past experiences resurface for reinterpretation, and future possibilities feel less predetermined. This stage often involves emotional processing, confronting unresolved experiences, and gradually loosening the grip of inherited beliefs. Beyond this, some describe a further shift in awareness referred to here as 5D, in which the sense of separation between self and others begins to soften. While the external world remains unchanged, it is experienced through a different interpretive lens. There is often a greater sense of presence, compassion, and interconnectedness. Judgment may decrease as understanding deepens, and life is perceived less as a problem to solve and more as an unfolding process to participate in. This is not an escape from human experience, but a reorientation within it. Importantly, these stages are not fixed destinations or hierarchical achievements. Human consciousness does not move in a straight line from lower to higher states. Instead, it fluctuates. We move between clarity and confusion, openness and contraction, connection and separation depending on context, stress, health, and life circumstances. What matters is not arrival at a final stage, but the increasing capacity to recognize these shifts as they occur. To explore consciousness in this way is to acknowledge a simple but profound idea. Experience is not just happening to us, we are participating in how it is shaped. The question is not which level we belong to, but how aware we are of the lens through which we are currently seeing. Chapter 1: The World of 3D, Survival and Separation. The most immediate layer of human experience, the one that feels the most solid. It is the world of physical form, external structure, and practical necessity. In this mode of awareness, life is experienced as something concrete and measurable. Time moves in a straight line, outcomes have consequences, and identity is shaped by visible roles and achievements. This is the domain of what we are calling 3D consciousness, not as a literal dimension, but as a way of perceiving reality through separation, survival, and structure. In this state, the mind organizes experience around stability and prediction. The primary question, often unspoken, is not who am I, but how do I stay safe. Safety can mean physical security, but also emotional acceptance, financial stability, or social belonging. Much of human behavior in this mode is guided by the need to reduce uncertainty and maintain a sense of control over an unpredictable world. Within this framework, identity becomes closely tied to external markers. People are defined and often define themselves by what they do, what they own, how they are perceived, and where they fit within larger systems. Titles, roles, and labels provide structure, helping the mind navigate complexity. While this structure is useful, it can also become limiting when identity is reduced entirely to these external forms. A defining feature of this mode is the sense of separation. The world is experienced as divided: self and other, success and failure, right and wrong, safe and unsafe. This separation is not an error in perception, so much as a natural outcome of how the brain organizes information. To function efficiently, the mind categorizes, compares, and distinguishes. But over time, these distinctions can harden into psychological boundaries that feel absolute rather than functional. In this framework, time is experienced as linear and directional. The past is something that has already happened, the future is something to prepare for, and the present becomes a narrow point of transition between the two. Much of mental activity is spent either reviewing what has been or anticipating what might come next. This creates a continuous sense of forward motion, but it can also generate anxiety, especially when the future feels uncertain or the past unresolved. Emotionally, this mode of consciousness is often governed by reactivity. Fear, desire, anger, and attachment play central roles in decision-making. These emotions are not problems in themselves. They are part of the human survival system. They signal threat, opportunity, connection, and loss. However, when they operate without awareness, they can shape perception in ways that feel automatic or unavoidable. It is important to understand that this 3D mode is not something to transcend in a dismissive sense. It is the foundation of embodied human life. Without it, there would be no structure, no coordination, and no ability to navigate the physical world. It provides the framework through which experience becomes practical and actionable. The goal is not to reject it, but to recognize it as one layer of a much broader spectrum of awareness. What defines this stage most clearly is not limitation, but focus. It is a mode of consciousness that prioritizes survival, clarity, and distinction. Yet within that clarity lies the beginning of something else, the quiet recognition that not all aspects of experience are fully explained by external conditions alone. That recognition marks the first subtle opening toward deeper forms of awareness, where the boundaries that seem so fixed may begin to feel more permeable than they first appear. Chapter 2: The Illusion of Separation. One of the most fundamental experiences within 3D consciousness is the sense of being separate from other people, from the world, and even from parts of oneself. This separation feels obvious, almost self-evident. There is me on one side of experience and everything else on the other. This division organizes how reality is interpreted, how decisions are made, and how meaning is constructed. Yet what feels like a fixed boundary is, in many ways, a learned perception. From early development onward, the human mind is trained to distinguish. A child learns quickly that they are distinct from their environment. This body is mine, that body is not. This feeling belongs to me, that reaction belongs to someone else. Language reinforces this separation by assigning names, roles, and categories to nearly everything perceived. Over time, these distinctions become so habitual that they are no longer noticed. They are simply assumed to be reality itself. This sense of separation is also reinforced by social and cultural structures. Society is built on differentiation, individual identity, personal achievement, competition, comparison, and role-based belonging. While these systems allow for organization and cooperation, they also strengthen the feeling that life is a collection of isolated units, interacting from a distance, rather than a continuous field of shared experience. Psychologically, separation serves an important function. It helps create a stable sense of identity. By defining what I am and what I am not, the mind establishes boundaries that support decision-making and self-preservation. Without these boundaries, experience would feel diffuse and difficult to navigate. In this sense, separation is not an error, it is a tool. However, when the tool is mistaken for the whole structure of reality, limitations arise. Perceiving life exclusively through separation can intensify feelings of isolation, comparison, and conflict. Other people may be experienced less as complex, conscious beings and more as extensions of threat, approval, competition, or validation. Even nature and environment can become objects to use rather than systems to relate to. What is often overlooked is that separation is primarily a cognitive model, not an absolute truth of experience. Beneath conceptual thinking, human beings share biological systems, emotional responses, and fundamental needs for connection, safety, and understanding. Empathy itself reveals this overlap. The ability to feel into another person's experience suggests that the boundary between self and other is more permeable than it appears. In moments of deep attention, whether through reflection, emotional presence, or direct human connection, the rigidity of separation can soften. A person may notice that their thoughts are influenced by environment, that their emotions are shaped by relationship, and that their sense of self shifts depending on context. These observations do not eliminate individuality, but they challenge the idea that individuality is isolated or self-contained. The illusion described here is not that separation does not exist in any form, but that it is absolute. It is a functional perspective that becomes restrictive only when it is taken as the entire picture. Recognizing this opens the possibility of a more fluid understanding of identity, one in which the self is not a sealed entity, but a dynamic process continually shaped through interaction with the world. In this way, the experience of separation becomes less of a final truth and more of a stage of perception, one that can be seen clearly, questioned gently, and eventually held alongside a wider awareness of connection. Chapter 3: Awakening the 4D Consciousness. At a certain point in life, the familiar structure of 3D experience begins to feel less absolute. The routines that once felt stable may start to feel repetitive. The roles that once defined identity may feel slightly constricting. Even success, failure, and social validation can begin to lose their ability to fully explain one's internal experience. This shift does not arrive all at once. It emerges gradually, often through curiosity, discomfort, or reflection. This transition is what we are calling the beginning of 4D consciousness, not a higher place, but a deeper mode of awareness. It is characterized by the turning of attention inward. Instead of only asking how to function in the external world, a new question begins to arise. Why do I experience the world the way I do? This shift is subtle but significant. The mind begins to observe itself. Thoughts are no longer just taken as truth. They are noticed as events occurring within awareness. Emotional reactions, once automatic, start to become visible in real time. A person may catch themselves reacting in a familiar way and, for the first time, recognize the pattern rather than being fully absorbed by it. This growing self-observation marks the beginning of psychological depth. It is not about becoming someone new, but about seeing what was previously unconscious. Memories may resurface with new clarity. Past experiences that were once dismissed or suppressed can reappear, not as fixed narratives, but as material to be understood differently. In this sense, awareness begins to widen, allowing more of one's inner world to become visible. As this inner attention strengthens, questions naturally expand beyond personal history. Patterns become noticeable across relationships, choices, and emotional responses. A person may begin to see repetition in their behaviors or recognize how certain environments consistently trigger specific states of mind. This recognition introduces a new form of responsibility, not blame, but awareness of participation in one's own experience. In this stage, time itself can feel different. It is not that time objectively changes, but that attention becomes less confined to the present moment as a narrow point. The past is no longer only a fixed story. It becomes something that can be reinterpreted. The future is no longer only a destination. It becomes a field of possibilities shaped by present awareness. This fluidity can create moments where life feels more interconnected. as if different parts of experience are speaking to one another. Emotionally, 4D consciousness often involves increased sensitivity. Feelings that were previously ignored or overridden may become more pronounced. This can be uncomfortable, as it disrupts old coping mechanisms, yet it also creates the possibility of integration. Instead of avoiding emotional experience, there is an opportunity to understand it, to allow it, and to learn from it. This is often where healing begins, not through control, but through acknowledgement. Importantly, this stage is not linear or permanent. A person may move in and out of this awareness many times. Moments of clarity can be followed by reactivity. Insight can be followed by forgetfulness. Rather than a fixed achievement, it is better understood as a capacity that develops over time. The capacity to notice, reflect, and return to awareness even after being absorbed by old patterns. What defines 4D consciousness most clearly is this shift from identification to observation. Life is still lived within the same external world, but the relationship to experience changes. Instead of being fully merged with thoughts and emotions, there is a growing sense that they are occurring within something larger, something capable of noticing, holding, and gradually understanding them. This is the beginning of awakening, not as an escape from reality, but as a deeper engagement with it. Chapter 4. Time becomes fluid. One of the most striking shifts in 4D consciousness is not just emotional or psychological, it is temporal. The experience of time, which once felt fixed, linear, and predictable, begins to loosen. Past, present, and future remain conceptually distinct, but the way they are felt in awareness changes. Time becomes less like a straight line and more like a field through which attention moves. In ordinary 3D awareness, time is experienced as a sequence. What has already happened is behind us. What is happening now is the only real moment, and what comes next is uncertain but inevitable. This structure is essential for functioning in daily life. It allows planning, memory, and causality to operate. However, it also narrows perception to a constant forward push, where the present is often overshadowed by what has already occurred or what is yet to come. As awareness deepens, this rigidity begins to soften. The past, instead of existing only as something completed, starts to reappear as something active within the present. Memories may surface unexpectedly, not just as recollection, but as emotionally charged experiences that feel immediate. These moments are not illusions. They are the mind reprocessing stored experience through a more conscious lens. What once felt resolved may return for reinterpretation, offering new insight or emotional release. Similarly, the future begins to feel less fixed. Rather than a single path unfolding ahead, it is experienced more as a range of possibilities influenced by present awareness. Decisions feel less like stepping onto a predetermined track and more like participating in an unfolding set of outcomes. This can create both uncertainty and openness, the recognition that life is not fully locked into a single direction. The present moment also changes in quality. Instead of being a narrow point between past and future, it becomes more expansive. Attention is less fragmented by constant projection or retrospection. There is a greater capacity to remain with immediate experience, sensations, emotions, and thoughts as they arise, without immediately leaving the moment to interpret or escape it. This does not mean thoughts about past or future disappear. Rather, they are experienced with less total absorption. In this shifting relationship to time, many people report an increase in meaningful coincidence or synchronicity, not necessarily as external events with hidden causes, but as heightened pattern recognition. When attention becomes more open and less dominated by rigid expectation, connections between events may feel more noticeable. The mind becomes more sensitive to relationships between timing, emotion, and circumstance, which can create the impression that life is responding more directly. From a psychological perspective, this fluidity is closely tied to memory and anticipation. The brain does not store the past as a perfect archive. It reconstructs it. Likewise, the future is continuously simulated based on present beliefs and emotional states. As these processes become more conscious, the experience of time naturally becomes less fixed. What changes is not time itself, but the degree to which awareness is identified with its linear structure. This stage can also bring challenges. When the boundaries of time soften, unresolved experiences may surface more frequently. Regret, grief, or unfinished emotional patterns can appear without warning, creating periods of inner intensity. At the same time, there can be moments of clarity, where time feels almost suspended, when attention is fully absorbed in presence, and the usual pressure of past and future temporarily dissolves. Ultimately, the fluidity of time in 4D consciousness is not about escaping linear reality. It is about recognizing that linear time is one way of organizing experience, not the totality of it. Life still unfolds moment by moment, but awareness is no longer confined to a single interpretation of that unfolding. Instead, it becomes possible to see time as something the mind participates in shaping through memory, attention, and expectation. In this way, time is no longer only a measure of movement forward. It becomes a reflection of consciousness itself, shifting, responsive, and more open than it first appears. Chapter 5: Emotional Integration and Shadow Work. As awareness deepens, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the parts of experience that were once pushed aside. Emotional life, which may have previously been managed through distraction, suppression, or rationalization, begins to surface with greater clarity. This is not because emotions have intensified in themselves, but because the capacity to avoid them has weakened. What emerges is a fuller encounter with the internal landscape of fear, anger, grief, desire, and shame. This stage is often described as emotional integration or shadow work, a term used to describe the process of bringing unconscious or disowned aspects of the self into conscious awareness. The shadow is not something external or mystical. It refers to those parts of personality that were learned to be unacceptable, unsafe, or unworthy of expression. These elements do not disappear when rejected. Instead, they remain active beneath awareness, influencing behavior in indirect and often repeated ways. In earlier stages of consciousness, it is common for emotional responses to be experienced as immediate reactions. A situation occurs, and an emotion follows automatically, often accompanied by a story that justifies or explains it. In this pattern, there is little space between stimulus and response. As awareness develops, that space begins to widen. Emotions can still arise strongly, but they are more likely to be noticed as they arise, rather than only after they have already shaped behavior. This shift creates a crucial change in relationship to emotion. Feelings are no longer viewed solely as problems to eliminate or forces to obey. Instead, they become information signals that point toward unmet needs, unresolved experiences, or internal conflicts. Fear may reveal where safety feels uncertain. Anger may point to boundaries that feel crossed. Sadness may surface where something meaningful has been lost or unacknowledged. Desire may highlight areas of longing or growth. In this way, emotion becomes a form of communication rather than interference. Shadow work is not a linear process of fixing the self. It is a gradual uncovering of what has already been present but not fully seen. Often, this involves revisiting earlier experiences with a new level of awareness. Events that once felt confusing or overwhelming can be reinterpreted when held with greater emotional capacity. This does not change the facts of the past, but it can change the relationship to those facts. A key aspect of this process is the reduction of internal resistance. Many emotional patterns persist not because they are strong, but because they are resisted. The attempt to avoid or control feeling often intensifies its presence. Integration begins when there is enough awareness to allow emotion to be felt, without immediate judgment or escape. This does not mean becoming passive or overwhelmed. It means developing the ability to stay present with experience as it moves through awareness. Over time, this practice can lead to a more stable internal environment. Emotional states still arise, but they are less likely to define identity or dictate action unconsciously. Instead of being identified as anger, fear, or sadness, there is a growing recognition that these are temporary states occurring within a broader field of awareness. This distinction, though subtle, changes the quality of experience significantly. It is important to acknowledge that emotional integration is not comfortable work. It often involves confronting memories, beliefs, and sensations that were avoided for good reason at earlier stages of life. However, avoidance does not eliminate these patterns. It only delays their resolution. When approached with patience and honesty, even difficult emotions can become gateways to greater clarity and self-understanding. In this sense, shadow work is not about becoming a different person, but about becoming more fully present to the person already here. It is the process of reclaiming parts of experience that were once separated out of necessity. As these parts are integrated, the sense of internal fragmentation begins to soften, and awareness becomes less divided against itself. This integration does not remove emotional life, it deepens it. Feelings remain, but they are no longer experienced solely as disruptions. Instead, they become part of a more coherent and conscious relationship with the self. Chapter 6. Breaking Old Programming. As inner awareness expands, a noticeable shift begins to occur in how beliefs are experienced. Ideas that once felt like simple truths about identity, success, relationships, morality, and purpose start to reveal themselves as learned patterns rather than fixed realities. This recognition does not necessarily reject these beliefs outright, but it changes the relationship to them. What once felt like "this is how things are" becomes "this is how I was taught to see things." This stage can be understood as the gradual unraveling of psychological programming. Programming here does not imply conspiracy or control in a literal sense, but rather the accumulation of conditioning from family systems, cultural norms, education, religion, media, and lived experience. From early development onward, human beings absorb frameworks for interpreting reality. These frameworks are necessary for functioning in society, but they also shape perception in ways that often go unquestioned. In earlier stages of consciousness, these inherited beliefs are typically experienced as self-evident. They form the background structure through which decisions are made and identity is constructed. A person may believe they are choosing freely, while much of their worldview is actually filtered through assumptions that were never consciously examined. These assumptions define what is considered possible, acceptable, or meaningful. As awareness deepens, these structures begin to surface. A person may notice contradictions in long-held beliefs or feel internal tension between inherited values and personal experience. This tension is often the first sign that conditioning is being seen rather than simply lived. What follows is not an immediate rejection of old frameworks, but a process of questioning them. This questioning can be both liberating and disorienting. On one hand, it creates space for new perspectives and greater authenticity. On the other, it can temporarily destabilize identity, as many aspects of self-concept are built upon these internalized systems. When foundational beliefs are examined, the structures built upon them naturally become less certain. A key feature of this stage is increased discernment. Rather than accepting ideas based on authority alone, there is a growing tendency to evaluate them through direct experience. The question shifts from "is this what I was taught?" to "does this align with what I actually observe and feel to be true?" This does not mean rejecting external knowledge, but rather integrating it with personal awareness. As old programming loosens, identity itself begins to feel more flexible. Roles that once felt fixed, such as professional identity, social identity, or even personality traits, can be seen as adaptive patterns rather than permanent definitions. This recognition can reduce the pressure to maintain a consistent image of self in every context. Instead, identity becomes more responsive to situation and growth. However, breaking old programming is not a single event. It is an ongoing process of noticing, questioning, and revising internal narratives. Some beliefs dissolve quickly, while others persist even after being recognized as limiting. Conditioning is often layered, and deeper assumptions may take time to surface. In some cases, old beliefs return under stress, demonstrating that integration is not linear. Importantly, this process is not about achieving a completely unconditioned mind. Some level of structure is necessary for functioning in the world. The aim is not to eliminate all programming, but to bring it into awareness so that it no longer operates invisibly. When beliefs are conscious, they become choices rather than automatic constraints. Over time, this creates a more open relationship to reality. Instead of experiencing the world through a single inherited lens, perception becomes more adaptable. New information can be considered without immediate resistance, and old frameworks can be updated rather than defended. This flexibility allows for a more nuanced and grounded understanding of both self and world. In this way, breaking old programming is less about rebellion and more about clarity. It is the process of seeing how perception has been shaped, and gradually reclaiming the ability to participate consciously in how that perception continues to evolve. Chapter 7. The Threshold Between 4D and 5D. There is a point in the unfolding of inner awareness where transformation stops feeling gradual and begins to feel unstable. What once seemed like steady growth in understanding can turn into a period of uncertainty, where old ways of being no longer hold, yet new ways have not fully stabilized. This is often experienced as a threshold, an in-between state where perception is shifting faster than identity can adapt. In this phase, the structures built in earlier stages begin to loosen more noticeably. Emotional reactions may still arise, but they are often recognized more quickly. Long-held beliefs may no longer feel convincing, even when they remain psychologically active. The mind starts to see its own patterns with increasing clarity, yet it cannot always stop them from operating. This creates a tension between awareness and habit. What makes this threshold distinct is not just insight, but the dissolution of certainty. The frameworks that once provided orientation about self, others, purpose, and reality begin to feel less stable. This can be experienced as confusion, disorientation, or even a sense of internal fragmentation. At times, it may feel as though multiple perspectives are competing within the same mind, each with its own logic and emotional weight. This is where many people encounter what is often described as ego dissolution, though it is rarely a clean or complete process. More often, it is a partial loosening of identification with fixed self-concepts. The ego, understood here as the organized sense of identity, does not disappear, but it becomes less rigid. It is no longer experienced as the only possible way of being, but as one configuration among many. During this stage, perception can fluctuate significantly. Moments of clarity, presence, and openness may be followed by periods of contraction, doubt, or emotional intensity. This oscillation is not a failure of progress, but a natural consequence of a system reorganizing itself. As old patterns release their dominance, the nervous system and psyche adjust to a less predictable internal landscape. One of the defining characteristics of this threshold is the weakening of absolute interpretation. Experiences that were once categorized quickly good or bad, right or wrong, meaningful or meaningless begin to resist simple labeling. Instead, there is a growing awareness of complexity. This does not eliminate judgment, but it introduces space around it, allowing multiple interpretations to coexist without immediate resolution. In this space of uncertainty, the sense of control can diminish. The desire to fix, define, or stabilize experience may become stronger precisely because it is less effective. Yet beneath this instability, something else begins to emerge, a quieter form of awareness that is less reactive and more observant. This awareness does not need to resolve everything immediately. It can witness change without collapsing into it. The threshold between 4D and what is described as 5D consciousness is not a place of arrival, but a transition in relationship to identity itself, where 4D is characterized by observation and emotional integration. This in-between phase tests the stability of that observation. It challenges whether awareness can remain present without reverting to old structures for reassurance. Importantly, this stage can feel intense because it removes familiar reference points, yet it is also where much of the deep restructuring occurs. Old identities are not simply discarded, they are seen more fully, experienced more consciously, and gradually released from exclusive identification. What remains is not emptiness, but openness. In this unfolding, the key shift is not the attainment of a higher state, but the loosening of attachment to any single state as permanent. Awareness begins to recognize itself as something that moves through experiences rather than being defined by them. This recognition lays the foundation for a more integrated form of consciousness, one that can hold complexity without needing to reduce it prematurely. The threshold, then, is not an endpoint disguised as chaos. It is the space where identity becomes less fixed, perception becomes more spacious, and consciousness learns to remain present, without relying on old certainties to define its shape. Chapter 8. Entering 5D Awareness. What is often described as 5D consciousness is not a destination that can be reached and permanently occupied, but a shift in how experience is held. It is less about moving beyond the human condition and more about relating to it with a different kind of awareness, one that is less fragmented, less reactive, and less defined by separation. In this stage, the sense of being a tightly isolated self begins to soften. This does not mean individuality disappears. Rather, the boundaries that once felt rigid become more permeable. The self is still present, still functioning, still engaging with the world, but it is no longer experienced as something fundamentally cut off from everything else. Instead, identity is felt more as a process, something dynamic, responsive, and continuously shaped by interaction. One of the most noticeable shifts in this mode of awareness is the reduction of internal resistance. Experiences are less frequently divided into what should be happening versus what is happening. This does not imply passive acceptance of all circumstances, but rather a clearer recognition of reality as it is before immediate interpretation or rejection occurs. In that space, response becomes more conscious and less automatic. Emotionally, there is often a greater capacity for compassion, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived perception. Other people are less easily reduced to roles, behaviors, or projections. Instead, they are experienced as complex systems of experience, each shaped by their own history, conditioning, and inner world. This recognition naturally softens judgment, not by suppressing discernment, but by expanding context. Attention itself becomes more present-centered. This does not mean the absence of thought about past or future, but a decreased tendency to become fully absorbed in them. Memory and anticipation still function, but they are held within a broader field of awareness that is anchored in immediacy. As a result, experience often feels more direct and less filtered through narrative explanation. In this state, life is less frequently interpreted as a problem to solve and more often experienced as a process to participate in. This shift does not remove challenges or difficulties, but it changes the relationship to them. Instead of immediately contracting around resistance, there is more space to observe, understand, and respond with flexibility. Action becomes less driven by fear or compulsion, and more guided by clarity and resonance. A key feature of this awareness is the diminished dominance of identity narratives. The stories we tell about who we are, our limitations, achievements, roles, and history still exist, but they carry less absolute weight. They are seen more as useful descriptions than as fixed definitions. This creates a subtle freedom, the ability to act without being entirely constrained by prior self-concept. Relationships also tend to shift in this mode of awareness. Rather than being primarily organized around need, validation, or lack, they become more responsive to authenticity and presence. This does not eliminate attachment or emotional complexity, but it reduces the sense that others exist to complete or define the self. Connection becomes less transactional and more experiential. It is important to emphasize that this is not a permanent or flawless state. Even within expanded awareness, patterns of reactivity, confusion, and contraction still arise. The difference lies in recognition. There is a growing capacity to notice when consciousness has narrowed and to return, more quickly and gently, to a broader perspective. In this sense, 5D awareness is better understood as a frequency of perception rather than a fixed identity. It is a way of seeing that can emerge in ordinary moments, during deep listening, in nature, in silence, in presence with another person, or even in the midst of everyday activity when attention is fully open. What defines this stage most clearly is not transcendence of human experience, but a shift in how deeply one is identified with its passing forms. Thoughts, emotions, and events continue to arise, but they are no longer mistaken as the totality of what one is. Instead, they are seen as movements within awareness itself. From this perspective, life is not something happening to a separate observer. It is a continuous unfolding in which awareness and experience are not truly divided. Chapter 9. Living from Unity Consciousness. As awareness stabilizes in this more expanded way of perceiving, a subtle but profound reorganization of experience begins to take place. Life is still lived through a human body, within a practical world of responsibilities, decisions, and relationships. Nothing about the external structure disappears. What changes is the sense of separation that once defined how that world was experienced. In this mode of consciousness, often described as unity awareness, the boundary between self and other is no longer felt as absolute. It may still appear conceptually, but experientially it becomes softer, more permeable. Other people are no longer primarily experienced as external objects to be evaluated, compared, or interpreted. Instead, they are experienced as expressions of the same field of awareness, each moving through their own unique perspective within a shared reality. This does not erase individuality. The body still has preferences, limits, and needs. The mind still functions with memory, language, and interpretation, but identity is no longer confined entirely within these structures. There is a growing recognition that thoughts arise in awareness, emotions move through awareness, and even the sense of I is something that appears within awareness rather than something that owns it. From this perspective, life feels less like a series of isolated events and more like a continuous unfolding. Experiences are not judged primarily as successes or failures, but understood as movements within a larger process of learning, adaptation, and expression. This does not mean moral clarity disappears or that discernment becomes weaker. Rather, judgment becomes less reactive and more contextual. A defining quality of unity consciousness is the shift from control to trust. This trust is not blind optimism or denial of difficulty. It is a recognition that life is already occurring, and that much of what was previously experienced as resistance was rooted in attempting to separate oneself from that flow. Trust, in this sense, is not about predicting outcomes, but about relating to uncertainty without contraction. In relationships, this shift often becomes especially noticeable. Interactions are less driven by the need to fix, change, or extract from others. Instead, there is a greater capacity to listen, to witness, and to respond without excessive projection. Conflict may still arise, but it is less likely to be experienced as a fundamental rupture in connection, and more as a moment of misalignment within an otherwise shared field of experience. Compassion in this state is not forced or idealized. It emerges naturally from perception, when behavior is no longer seen as entirely separate from context, history, and conditioning. It becomes harder to reduce others to simple categories of good or bad. This does not eliminate accountability, but it changes the emotional charge behind it. Understanding and responsibility begin to coexist more easily. Time, too, is experienced differently. The urgency that often comes from identification with personal narrative softens. There is still planning, remembering, and decision-making, but these functions feel less like survival mechanisms and more like practical tools. Within a broader, present-moment awareness, the present becomes less of a narrow point between past and future and more of an ongoing field in which both are contained. Importantly, unity consciousness is not a state of constant serenity. Human emotions still arise. Pain, frustration, grief, and uncertainty still appear. The difference is not in the absence of these experiences, but in the absence of total identification with them. Emotions are felt fully, but they are not mistaken as the entirety of what one is. In this way, unity is not an escape from individuality, but a recontextualization of it. The personal self is no longer experienced as isolated or central, but as one expression among many within a larger, interconnected reality. This recognition brings a quieter kind of stability, one that does not depend on circumstances remaining favorable, but on the understanding that all circumstances are part of a single unfolding process. To live from unity consciousness is not to withdraw from the world, but to engage with it without the constant recreation of separation. It is to participate in life while recognizing that the participant and the participated are not truly apart. Chapter 10. Integration of all dimensions. The culmination of this unfolding is not the disappearance of earlier stages, but their integration. What was once described as separate levels of consciousness, survival-based awareness, introspective awareness, and unity awareness are not discarded or transcended in a permanent way. Instead, they are recognized as functional modes of a single, continuous field of experience. In practical life, all of these modes remain necessary. The capacity to plan, analyze, and respond to external demands still belongs to what was earlier described as 3D awareness. The ability to reflect, process emotion, and recognize patterns continues to arise through the qualities associated with 4D awareness. The sense of connection, presence, and reduced separation characteristic of 5D awareness also remains available. None of these are higher in an absolute sense. They are different ways consciousness organizes itself depending on context. Integration begins when these modes are no longer mistaken for identity. Instead of thinking I am a survival-based person or I am an awakened person, there is a growing recognition that different forms of awareness arise depending on situation, attention, and inner state. Identity becomes less like a fixed structure and more like a flexible point of reference through which experience is temporarily organized. This shift reduces internal conflict. Earlier stages often involve tension between parts of the self. One part that reacts emotionally, another that reflects, another that seeks meaning or transcendence. In integration, these are no longer experienced as opposing forces, but as complementary functions within a single system. Emotional response, analytical thought, and intuitive perception begin to operate with less contradiction and more cooperation. A key aspect of integration is the return to ordinary life with greater awareness. There is no separation between spiritual experience and everyday experience. Activities such as working, speaking, listening, resting, or making decisions are no longer divided into sacred and mundane categories. Instead, the quality of attention brought to any moment becomes the primary difference. Presence itself becomes the consistent thread. In this integrated state, emotional experience does not disappear, nor does it lose importance. Rather, it becomes more transparent. Emotions arise, are felt, are understood, and then pass without necessarily defining identity or dictating long-term narrative. Similarly, thoughts continue to appear, but they are less likely to be mistaken for absolute truth. They are recognized as mental events within awareness, useful in some contexts and limited in others. One of the most significant outcomes of integration is increased adaptability. Life is no longer approached from a single fixed perspective, but from a range of available modes. In moments requiring focus and structure, analytical clarity becomes primary. In moments requiring emotional depth, feeling and reflection take precedence. In moments requiring openness and presence, a more unified awareness becomes available. The capacity to move between these without confusion or attachment becomes a form of maturity. Importantly, integration does not imply perfection or permanent stability. Human experience remains dynamic. Stress, uncertainty, emotional intensity, and unconscious patterns still arise. The difference lies in relationship. Rather than being identified with any single state, there is increasing awareness of states as temporary configurations within a broader field of consciousness. This recognition allows for quicker return to balance and less internal fragmentation. Over time, the idea of ascending through levels becomes less relevant. What matters more is depth of awareness in any given moment. A person may experience fear and still remain aware. They may experience confusion and still maintain perspective. They may experience clarity and still avoid attachment to it. Consciousness is no longer measured by where it is imagined to be, but by how consciously it is being lived. Ultimately, integration is not a final destination, but an ongoing practice of coherence. It is the ability to include more of experience without rejection, distortion, or fragmentation. It is the recognition that all perceived dimensions of consciousness are, expressions of the same underlying awareness, differentiated only by focus and degree of identification. In this way, the journey from 3D to 5D is revealed not as a path away from reality, but as a gradual return to it seen more fully, experienced more directly, and lived with greater awareness of its continuous unfolding nature. Conclusion: remembering what was never lost. The language of 3D, 4D, and 5D offers a way to describe shifts in perception, but it is not a map of places to arrive at or stages to permanently achieve. It is a symbolic framework for understanding something far more ordinary and far more immediate: the changing way human awareness relates to itself and to life. What this exploration reveals is not a journey away from the world, but a gradual change in how the world is experienced. The same life can feel fragmented or unified, mechanical or meaningful, constricted or open, depending not on external circumstances alone, but on the quality of attention and identification present in each moment. Consciousness does not move outside reality, it reshapes the lens through which reality is interpreted. At the beginning of this arc, experience is dominated by structure, survival, and separation. Life is organized around stability and definition, and identity is closely tied to external roles and conditions. As awareness deepens, attention turns inward, patterns become visible, emotions become intelligible, and the mind begins to observe itself rather than only react. From there, the sense of separation may soften further, revealing moments of connection, presence, and expanded awareness in which life feels less divided and more continuous. Yet none of these modes replaces the others. They coexist, they interpenetrate, they reappear depending on stress, context, relationship, and focus. The idea of a linear ascent begins to dissolve when it becomes clear that human consciousness is not a ladder, but a spectrum of capacities that are constantly being reorganized in real time. In this light, transformation is not about becoming someone new. It is about recognizing what has always been present. Beneath shifting layers of perception, awareness itself does not need to be constructed or achieved. It is already here prior to interpretation, prior to identity, prior to the stories that describe it. What changes over time is not the presence of awareness, but the degree to which it is identified with its contents. Thoughts arise, emotions move, roles are played, and experiences unfold. Yet behind all of this remains the simple fact of knowing, the capacity to be aware at all. As this recognition stabilizes, experience becomes less about escape or attainment, and more about clarity in the midst of what is already happening. In the end, the journey described in these chapters is less a progression through dimensions and more a refinement of attention. It is the gradual loosening of rigid identification and the increasing ability to include more of experience without fragmentation. This does not remove challenge or complexity from life. It changes the way they are held. What remains is not a final state of perfection, but a deeper intimacy with reality as it is. A life that is still human, still changing, still uncertain but increasingly met with awareness rather than unconscious reaction. The shift, then, is not into another world. It is a return to this one seen more clearly, felt more fully, and lived with less separation between what is happening and the awareness in which it appears.